Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling strangely guilty, even though you couldn't explain why? Maybe you entered that conversation feeling confident about what happened. You knew what you saw, you knew what you felt, you had every reason to believe your concerns were valid, but somehow by the time the conversation ended, you found yourself apologizing, not because you had done something wrong, but because you no longer trusted your own reality. If you've experienced something like this, you're not alone. One of the most damaging aspects of narcissistic relationships is that they don't rely on obvious forms of control. Most people imagine manipulation as something dramatic. They picture shouting, threats, aggression, or someone openly trying to dominate another person. But narcissistic manipulation is usually much quieter than that. It's psychological. It happens one conversation at a time, one subtle criticism, one carefully timed compliment, one confusing argument, one broken promise. Until one day you realize you're no longer making decisions based on your own thoughts and feelings. You're making decisions based on how you think someone else will react. That's when you know the mind games have already begun. The phrase mind games can sound dramatic, almost like something from a movie. But in reality, mind games are often invisible. They're not designed to attract attention. They're designed to avoid it. Because manipulation works best when the person experiencing it doesn't realize it's happening. That's what makes narcissistic mind games so effective. They don't simply influence your behavior. They slowly reshape your perception of yourself. You begin questioning your judgment, your memory, your emotions, your instincts. Eventually, you stop asking whether the narcissist's behavior is healthy. Instead, you begin asking whether you're the problem. That shift is incredibly important. Because once someone convinces you to doubt yourself, they no longer need to control every situation. Your self-doubt begins doing much of the work for them. One of the biggest misconceptions about narcissistic manipulation is the belief that narcissists are always calculating every move. Human behavior is often much more complicated than that. Some narcissistic individuals consciously manipulate, others have developed unhealthy patterns over many years and repeat them almost automatically. Regardless of whether the behavior is deliberate or deeply ingrained, the impact on the other person can be remarkably similar. The result is confusion, exhaustion, self-doubt, and a gradual loss of confidence. That's why this conversation isn't about trying to understand every motivation behind narcissistic behavior. It's about understanding its effects on you. Because healing begins when you stop asking, why are they doing this? And start asking, what is this doing to me? Those two questions lead in completely different directions. The first keeps your attention focused on the narcissist. The second brings your attention back to yourself. And that's where recovery begins. One of the first mind games narcissists often play is creating uncertainty. Human beings naturally seek predictability. Our nervous systems relax when we know what to expect. Consistency creates emotional safety, but narcissistic relationships often operate through inconsistency. One day you're praised, the next day you're criticized. One week you're told you're the most important person in their life. The following week they become distant, dismissive, or emotionally unavailable. At first this inconsistency feels confusing, then it becomes stressful. Eventually it becomes normal. You begin spending enormous amounts of mental energy trying to predict which version of the person you're going to encounter today. Will they be kind? Will they be angry? Will they ignore you? Will they suddenly become affectionate again? Without realizing it, you shifted your attention away from living your own life. Now you're constantly monitoring theirs. Psychologists sometimes describe this as hypervigilance. Your brain becomes highly alert to even the smallest changes in tone of voice, facial expression, body language, or texting habits. You aren't doing this because you've suddenly become insecure. You're doing it because your nervous system has learned that emotional safety depends on accurately predicting another person's moods. Living this way is exhausting. Many people believe they've developed anxiety. Sometimes what they've actually developed is a survival strategy. There's an important difference. Anxiety tells you something feels unsafe. Survival strategies develop when that feeling continues for months or years. Over time, these strategies become automatic. You check your phone repeatedly. You analyze every message. You replay conversations in your mind before going to sleep. You become afraid of saying the wrong thing. You begin apologizing before you've even expressed your opinion. And perhaps the saddest part is that this slowly starts feeling normal. When people have lived inside emotionally unhealthy relationships for a long time, they often forget what emotional safety actually feels like. Calm starts feeling unfamiliar. Consistency starts feeling boring. Predictability starts feeling suspicious. Chaos begins to feel like chemistry. That is one of the greatest psychological tricks narcissistic relationships play. They don't simply teach you to tolerate dysfunction. They quietly redefine what love feels like. Instead of associating love with peace, you begin associating it with uncertainty. Instead of associating intimacy with trust, You associate it with emotional intensity. Instead of feeling secure when someone consistently shows up for you, you feel drawn toward people whose affection is unpredictable. This isn't because you're broken. It's because your nervous system adapts to whatever environment it spends the most time in. The encouraging news is that what the nervous system learns, it can also unlearn. But that process begins with awareness. You cannot change a pattern you cannot recognize. And that's why education is so powerful. The moment you begin recognizing narcissistic mind games for what they are, they start losing some of their power. Because manipulation depends on confusion. Clarity interrupts manipulation. The more clearly you see the pattern, the less likely you are to mistake it for love. And perhaps that is the first real step toward freedom, not changing the narcissist, but changing the way you understand the relationship. Once you begin seeing the game, you no longer have to keep playing it. One of the most effective mind games a narcissist uses is not making you feel powerless. It's making you feel responsible. There's a significant difference. If someone openly tried to take away your freedom, you would probably recognize it immediately. You would resist. You would question it. You might even leave. But if someone convinces you that their happiness depends on your behavior, the situation becomes much more complicated. Suddenly, every disagreement feels like your fault. Every conflict becomes something you must fix. Every disappointment becomes your responsibility. You begin thinking, maybe I shouldn't have said that. Maybe I could have handled it differently. Maybe if I were more patient, this wouldn't keep happening. Notice how quickly your attention shifts. Instead of asking whether their behavior is healthy, you're asking how you can become a better version of yourself. Growth is a wonderful thing. Self-reflection is healthy. Taking responsibility for your own mistakes is an essential part of emotional maturity, but narcissistic mind games distort these healthy qualities. They take your empathy and quietly turn it against you. The more compassionate you are, the more guilty you feel. The more responsible you are, the more responsibility you're expected to carry. The more forgiving you become, the less accountability the other person takes. Eventually, you're carrying the emotional weight of an entire relationship by yourself, and that's impossible. Relationships were never meant to function that way. Healthy relationships involve shared responsibility. Both people apologize, both people listen, both people grow, both people are willing to acknowledge when they've caused pain. In narcissistic relationships, however, accountability often flows in only one direction. You become the problem solver, the peacekeeper, the emotional caretaker. Meanwhile, the narcissist remains focused on protecting their own image rather than repairing the relationship. Over time, this imbalance becomes exhausting, not because you're weak, but because no one can continuously carry emotional burdens that belong to someone else. Another powerful mind game is creating what feels like impossible standards. At first, the expectations seem reasonable. Maybe they ask you to communicate more clearly. Maybe they want you to spend more time together. Maybe they ask for honesty. Those requests by themselves are perfectly healthy. But gradually, the expectations begin changing. You meet one expectation. Another immediately appears. You fix one complaint. A different complaint replaces it. You apologize. They remind you of something else you did 6 months ago. You improve in one area. Now you're criticized in another. No matter what you accomplish, it never feels like enough. This leaves many people believing they are constantly failing. But the reality is often very different. The goalposts keep moving. And when the goalposts keep moving, success becomes impossible. Imagine running a race where the finish line moves every time you get close. Would you ever feel successful? Of course not. Not because you're incapable, but because the race was designed so that you could never actually finish. Many survivors of narcissistic relationships describe feeling exactly like this. They spent years trying to become good enough. Good enough to stop the criticism. Good enough to stop the arguments. Good enough to finally feel loved. But here's the heartbreaking truth. You cannot earn emotional safety by becoming perfect. Because perfection was never the issue. Control was. One of the most confusing experiences in narcissistic relationships is that your strengths slowly become your weaknesses. If you're kind, you're told you're naive. If you're confident, you're called arrogant. If you're successful, you're accused of neglecting the relationship. If you're independent, you're made to feel selfish. If you're emotional, you're described as unstable. If you're calm, you're accused of being cold. Notice the pattern. Whatever quality you possess eventually becomes something to criticize. This creates enormous psychological confusion. You begin wondering which version of yourself is acceptable. So you start changing. You become quieter, less expressive, less ambitious, more careful, more apologetic, more willing to ignore your own needs, Little by little, you're no longer living authentically. You're performing. You're constantly adjusting yourself to avoid criticism. The tragedy is that this performance never truly works, because narcissistic mind games aren't designed to help you succeed. They're designed to keep you uncertain. When you're uncertain, you're easier to influence. When you're confident, you're much harder to manipulate. That's why one of the first things healing restores is confidence. Not confidence that you're perfect, but confidence that your thoughts, feelings, and experiences deserve to be trusted. Perhaps the most painful realization for many survivors comes after the relationship ends. They don't simply grieve the other person, they grieve themselves. They look back and wonder, where did I go? When did I stop laughing the way I used to? When did I become afraid to express my opinions? When did I lose confidence in myself? Those questions are incredibly important because they remind us that narcissistic abuse isn't only about what someone did to you. It's also about the relationship you gradually lost with yourself. The good news is that the authentic self rarely disappears completely. It becomes buried beneath fear, beneath self-doubt, beneath survival. Healing is not about becoming someone new. It's about uncovering the person who existed before the manipulation began. It's about remembering your own voice, trusting your own judgment, believing your own experiences, and giving yourself permission to stop explaining away behavior that consistently hurts you. One of the most powerful moments in recovery is when you stop asking, how do I make them understand me? And start asking, why have I spent so much energy trying to convince someone to value what I should never have had to prove? That single question changes everything because it shifts your focus away from earning love and toward recognizing that healthy love never asks you to abandon yourself in order to receive it. And that is the moment the mind games begin to lose their grip. Not because the narcissist suddenly changes, but because you do. You stop participating in conversations designed to confuse you. You stop defending your reality to someone committed to denying it. You stop measuring your worth by another person's approval, and instead you begin building something far more powerful than their validation. You begin rebuilding your relationship with yourself. That relationship is the one no narcissist can ever truly take away. Breaking free from narcissistic mind games doesn't usually happen in one dramatic moment. It rarely begins with a powerful confrontation. It doesn't always start the day you leave the relationship. More often it begins with a quiet realization, a moment when something inside you says this isn't healthy anymore. That realization may seem small, but psychologically it's enormous because manipulation survives in confusion. The moment confusion begins turning into clarity, the dynamic starts to change. For perhaps the first time in a long while, you stop asking, how do I make this relationship work? And begin asking, what is this relationship doing to me? That question shifts your attention back to the one person you've been neglecting, yourself. One of the most difficult parts of recovery is accepting that clarity doesn't immediately erase attachment. Many people expect that once they understand they're being manipulated, leaving should become easy. Unfortunately, human psychology doesn't work that way. Knowledge and emotion often move at different speeds. You may fully understand that someone is unhealthy for you and still miss them. You may recognize the manipulation and still hope they'll change. You may know the relationship is damaging and still feel an overwhelming urge to return. This doesn't mean you failed. It doesn't mean the relationship was healthy. It means you're human. Emotional bonds don't disappear simply because you've gained insight. They dissolve gradually as your nervous system learns that safety no longer depends on that person. Give yourself permission to heal at the pace your mind and body require. Recovery is not a race. It is a process of gently teaching yourself that peace is no longer something you have to earn. One of the greatest challenges after leaving a narcissistic relationship is the silence. Not just the silence between you and the other person, the silence inside your own mind. For so long, your thoughts may have revolved around anticipating their reactions. You monitored their moods, their words, their expressions, their approval. Suddenly, all of that disappears. At first, the silence can feel uncomfortable. Some people even mistake peace for emptiness because chaos had become so familiar. This is one of the hidden effects of prolonged emotional manipulation. Your nervous system becomes accustomed to living in a constant state of alertness. When the danger is gone, your body doesn't immediately believe it. You may still feel anxious. You may still expect criticism. You may still feel guilty for making decisions that are completely reasonable. That doesn't mean you've made the wrong choice. It simply means your mind is adjusting to a healthier reality. Healing often feels unfamiliar before it begins feeling peaceful. As you recover, you'll notice something remarkable. The things that once consumed your attention begin losing their power. You stop checking your phone every few minutes. You stop replaying old conversations. You stop wondering whether you should have explained yourself differently. Instead, your energy slowly returns. You begin reconnecting with hobbies you abandoned. You reach out to friends you haven't spoken to in years. You laugh more freely. You sleep more peacefully. You notice that your body feels lighter because it is no longer carrying the constant weight of emotional uncertainty. This is what emotional freedom looks like. Not perfection, not endless happiness, but the ability to wake up each day without organizing your life around someone else's instability. That freedom is priceless. And one of the most powerful lessons recovery teaches is that boundaries are not punishments. Many survivors struggle with guilt when they begin setting limits. They worry, am I being selfish? Am I being unkind? Shouldn't I give them one more chance? These questions are understandable, especially if you spent years believing that your value came from taking care of everyone else. But healthy boundaries are not acts of rejection. They are acts of self-respect. A boundary simply says, I will no longer participate in interactions that consistently harm my well-being. It doesn't require anger. It doesn't require revenge. It doesn't require proving anyone wrong. In fact, one of the healthiest boundaries is often the quietest. You stop explaining, you stop defending, you stop trying to convince someone to understand a reality they've repeatedly chosen to ignore. You redirect that energy toward people who demonstrate respect through their actions, because real respect is never something you have to beg for. There is another important truth that often gets overlooked. Not everyone will understand why you chose to leave. Some people only saw the charming side of the narcissist. Others may encourage forgiveness without understanding the full pattern of manipulation. That can feel incredibly lonely. But remember this, other people's understanding is not required for your healing. You don't need universal agreement to protect your mental health. You don't need permission to leave a relationship that repeatedly damages your sense of self. The people who truly care about your well-being may not understand every detail of your experience, but they will respect your need for safety. As time passes, something beautiful begins to happen. You stop defining yourself by what happened to you. Instead, you begin defining yourself by how you responded. You discover strengths you never knew you possessed. Resilience, wisdom, discernment, self-compassion. You become more careful about who earns access to your life. Not because you're fearful, but because you've learned that trust is something built through consistent behavior, not charming words. Perhaps the greatest victory isn't that you become impossible to hurt. No one reaches that point. The greatest victory is that you become far less willing to ignore the early signs that once kept you trapped. You begin paying attention when someone's words don't match their actions. You notice how they respond to accountability. You observe whether they respect your boundaries. You ask yourself not only do they like me, but also do I genuinely feel emotionally safe around them? Those questions become your compass, and they lead you toward relationships built on mutual respect rather than emotional confusion. So if you're listening to this today and you're beginning to recognize these patterns in your own life, I want you to remember one thing. The fact that someone manipulated you does not mean you're weak. It often means you cared deeply. You believed in people. You wanted connection. Those qualities are not flaws. They are strengths. The goal is not to stop being compassionate. The goal is to pair compassion with wisdom, to pair kindness with boundaries, to pair empathy with self-respect. Because when those qualities exist together,